Good morning. My name's Aaron Weaver. I'm from Holmes County, Ohio. We farm approximately 40 acres of produce, and we have what we call a hot house. It's a 26 by 96 heated high tunnel, and we're just in the process of redoing it right now. We had the misfortune of having it blown apart last June. So if you have high tunnels, make sure you anchor them down well. Mine is on, the end pipes on the sides are welded on a 4-inch casing. That way we can move them around if we want to, if the wind doesn't do it. Before we even got planted the first year, we had it moved by the wind 2 times. We was fortunate we had a stove on the north end, which kept from blowing over. So the stove weighs around 1,600 pounds, so that's what kept the greenhouse from blowing over. We grow tomatoes in our high tunnel house, and we've also experimented with some yellow squash, beans, and so forth. But as far as having success, the tomatoes seem to be the best growing product. That's all I have for now.
Eric, how often do you move your greenhouse? How often do you move that in that area?
This is the 4th year we're planting in it, and we moved it once so far, and we're planning on moving it again this spring.
When do you produce the first tomato crop? How early?
At the end of May. We're planning on planting around the 20th of February.
And you stagger your crop?
No, just one planting.
Just one plant?
Yes. And we experimented with different varieties, like determinate and indeterminate. We're planning on only using indeterminate from now on, and sorghum and prunum.
Aaron, why are you moving the tunnels? What's the primary reason?
Primary reason is for diseases. That's the primary reason. It'd be nice to have it sitting there all the time, but the diseases want to come in.
Do you use black plastic? You plan to use black plastic?
Yes, we do. Either it's black plastic or green plastic. Do you use black plastic for mulch? We do. Green or black. It suppresses the weeds. Yes.
What varieties did you mention?
Variety?
Varieties of tomatoes?
We use Mountain Fresh as determinate. Big Beef is what we use so far.
What are you heating it to when you're heating in the early months?
Wood. Only wood.
What temperature are you heating it to?
What temperature we heating it? We don't have a specific temperature, but it really varies in the winter. You've got a hard time keeping it warm enough once it goes down to like 15 or 10 degrees and be windy. But we never had any problem with a freeze coming in. But if you've got a wood stove in there, be prepared to go out at night and fire up the stove. If we plant in the soil, we plant directly in the soil. It's not a hydroponic greenhouse.
Aaron, do you direct seed or transplant? Is that what your question was? Yeah, do you direct seed or transplant?
Transplant. The transplants, the seed has to be done in right around Christmas time or a little after. And we do have somebody else start our plants because we just don't have any luck starting our transplant that early. Yes.
How did you have the tunnels fastened down before, and how do you have them fastened down after the blowover?
The first time, we didn't have it anchored down anything. But last summer we had the west sides we had anchored was like you used to anchor posts, like a auger type, and strapped it up with nylon straps tied down. But I'd recommend have it anchored all the way through, because we had it anchored down the west side, and the wind came in through the south from an opening and pushed out our east side. So we ended up having our hoops going the wrong way. They came down the middle.
Aaron, if you could, we'll take questions from
Sure.
the rest of the whole
Good.
group here. Yeah, Joe.
As a high tunnel novice, what are some of the beginner mistakes that I can avoid?
Otho, you want to comment?
I understand your question, that as a beginning high tunnel user, what are some of the mistakes to avoid? Well, I would say the first place you need to find your best soil. Do not put a tunnel on your worst soil or put it out of the way where you think it might be not the best place, because if you're going to put up a tunnel, you need to invest in the best soil because that's where you're growing. I say that'd be number one.
Well, I just add to that. Boy, there are just so many mistakes I've made. I don't know whether I've really learned. You know, we heard about wind, and definitely, you know, if you put up a high tunnel, when the wind starts blowing, you're going to get a little bit nervous. It's going to be a different life. But that's not to say that they need to be, that every time the wind blows, that they're going to blow away. And, you know, we just can't do anything about tornadoes. But you basically, you know, the systems for applying poly are really good. In addition to the what Otho mentioned about good soil, make sure that you have good drainage. Because what you don't want to have is you don't want to have be growing in a puddle, and you don't want to have water pouring into your high tunnel in the middle of the winter, especially, and forming ice and so on. And actually, raised beds, if you can do it, are probably a good idea in most cases. You know, that issue of roll-up sides versus basically, I don't know what the answer is, but what you want to do is you want to avoid, basically inside of tunnels, plants are going to grow much more vigorously than they do outside. It's kind of like they're in a shade condition and they're not getting hit by wind and so on, so they're going to be more compact. And so you may find that you need to actually apply less fertilizer, and you may need to have a little bit of more space between them than you think, because your first initial reaction is, oh gosh, I've got to pack them in just as tight as possible, and because it's valuable space, and that may be a little bit of a mistake.
If I could follow up on your comment about wind. I know it's been talked about already a few times here today. When we put up the 4 that we will see here over lunchtime, oriented the way they are, although my first thought is I'm going to get a call from the State Highway Patrol some night and say that my tunnels are down on Route 83. So far, they've been through some tornadoes and some serious wind, and they've stayed put. What are the typical winds out on the plains where you're working, Ted?
We get strong prevailing winds out of the southwest for quite a period of time. And so, and I have east-west facing oriented tunnels, and I have north-south oriented tunnels. Certainly those hay groves, they're supposed to be the long side toward the wind, and so those are north-south oriented. But the east-west doesn't seem to make all that much difference. We had the microburst associated with a thunderstorm that came and just destroyed everything in August of 2004. And so I couldn't compare, designs because they were all broken. And then the PVC one was broken, the other one was broken. I always get nervous when the wind blows, especially after that. But I always come back in the morning and everything's fine. So, you know, I mean, occasionally there'll be just a little something, you know, like the ones that we had rope holding in the sidewalls, the rope got rotten, and so one of the sidewalls is blowing out. Or I was reconstructing and I didn't do the job right, and so the end walls got ruined. So, but yeah, and we have, you know, it's really the high, I mean, and you hear about people 60, 70 miles an hour, you know, straight line winds, and they're with a standalone tunnel, and they're just fine, they hold up. But it's that kind of impulsive force associated with thunderstorms that really does the damage. It's those huge bursts that, you know, and whipping, and I went out to visit a guy the other day, and he says, you know, my plastic, it won't stay on, what am I doing wrong? And he had this farm tech 30 by 96, and 2 times now he had to replace the plastic. And so I went out and looked at it, and I don't know whether I'm right or not, but he hadn't attached the purlins very adequately to the end hoops. You know, you have bolts and you have to tighten them up. And so what I figure is that, you know, the wind starts blowing and this thing's all flapping around, and then you know, I said tighten up your bolts and you probably won't have it blow off again. I hope that's true.
So the original question, if we could go back to it really briefly, I know that there are others to follow. As a novice high tunnel user, what are some of the mistakes to avoid? And we've heard site selection is a big one, not putting it in well-drained, quality soil. It doesn't matter. I mean, the design issue is still something we're going to get into in a bigger way. Keith, are there any comments that you'd like to add about kind of rookie mistakes, if you will?
Well, I think I agree totally with where your runoff is going to go, especially on a structure like mine that it covers an acre. I have 6 bays that are 300 feet long and 24 feet wide, and they're all connected. So our rookie mistake was placing the tunnel because hay groves don't have to be on a leveled site. Our site was an excellent choice, except it should be 40 feet to the west. What happens is the terrain tends to kick up at one end, so the drainage is an issue that the water doesn't want to leave the tunnel. So we have to do a little extra handwork every year. So that was a really good point. I think wind, in my experience, we have not sustained damage to that structure. My hoops at the center of the bay are about 14 feet off the ground. So this is a big wind attractor. It's a wind magnet. You know, anytime the wind's blowing, I start thinking about it right away. But after 5 years, we haven't had any damage, and I credit that to management by paranoia. You know, just be paranoid the first few years. Find out what your structure can do no matter what kind of structure you buy. Just overmanage it a little bit the first few years, because honestly, if you lose the structure, your investment is set back years. You know, if you manage your structure perfectly, it should, with a hay grove, it paid us back in 3 years. If we had lost it, that would have been a 6-year payback. And then right there, you think about all the profit you just lost. So when we did ours face east-west, so that the first stage of ventilation is opening the doors, lets the air move down through the tunnels. It also helps with removing heat. And with hay groves, they're a little bit different. Our advice is to, in high winds, that you need to vent. You need to open the structure. The way the hay grove vents is from the gutter up instead of the sidewalls. Basically, I leave my sidewalls in place all year long, even over winter. When the top of the structure is off, I still have my sidewalls out there, because basically, if you can, the logistics and the dynamic of wind is that if there's a discrepancy in pressure, high winds on the outside, no wind on the inside, essentially you're creating a pressure differential, and it wants to lift the structure out of the ground. So by venting, you allow the pressure to equalize. The wind can't really get a hold of your structure and do as much damage. So in one particular instance, we had Hurricane Isabella came through, I think in 2003 or 2004 maybe. We had sustained winds of 50 to 55 mile an hour with gusts to 70. And I didn't sustain a bit of damage on that structure. A few clips popped off here and there, and it happened overnight, so it was really a rough night for me. I got up, I was there at first daylight, standing in the structure. We still had 40, 45 mile an hour winds, and everything was just shaking and literally scaring the crap out of me that it was going to come down. But at that point, the worst of the winds were over. Another thing about tunnels is they will protect crops in that situation. I had sunflowers in there that were 5 feet high, and because the ground didn't get soaked, they didn't blow down. Right next to that, I had a half acre of outside production, and that outside production was leveled because the soaking ground, the high winds, just knocked everything down.
Aaron, you spoke of some of the challenges that you faced in the early years. Any recommendations that you could offer for somebody who's getting into it for the first time or new to it?
Just by hearing what the question was about preventing the problems. There's a couple growers that started in this year, and 2 of them had a problem with overwatering. Be careful and don't overwater them just right after transplanting. They need moisture to start growing, but please don't overdo it. It's not, if you got a 26 by 100 greenhouse, it won't be an acre. So you got to put your calculations on that. Other than that, I don't have anything in mind right now, but if you want to prevent some problems, please use the tie-downs or something to keep your hoop house in place.
How's he water? How's he irrigate?
Aaron, how are you irrigating?
We got a couple of 100-gallon tanks in the greenhouse, and we irrigate from them, from well water.
There was another hand over in the back. Yes, go ahead.
With the talk of all the damage, does everybody insure these buildings, or how's that handled?
Fair question. Do we have insurance on these buildings usually?
Mine are not insured simply because the insurance costs would outweigh the, you wouldn't be able to afford the insurance. If I could afford the insurance, I probably wouldn't be farming. So.
No insurance on my buildings.
If I could jump in real quickly, I know that there are other questions to follow, but just as a comment, you may know that we are audio taping the whole workshop minus the tour, okay? Young gentleman sitting over there against the wall, he's recording everything that's being said into the microphones. And each registrant will receive, or are eligible to receive, a copy of that audio recording, okay? That will be obviously something that we follow up with you on, so you need to make sure that we have your address, your complete mailing address. An email will also help just in case we need to clarify something. So before you leave today, if for some reason we have an incomplete mailing address from you, make sure that Leah has it. Also, because we are audio recording and the technology is the way it is, they prefer to go in about 1-hour segments, okay, at the most. Now this first one is 1 hour and 15 minutes. So what we're going to do in about 5 to 7 is we're going to take a short break, allow the audio person to do their thing, and in the meantime, for those who might be a little bit shy about speaking up, there are these index cards. They started at the ends of each table. Grab a card and write your question down, and then we will make sure, at least we hope, to get all the questions answered. And if not, they will be questions that we can follow up on, okay? So during that 5 to 7 minute break while the audio person is switching over, we can write questions on note cards and then pick up the discussion after that. I have one question, if I could, about the design issue, and I think that this is, at least from my perspective, something that experienced users encounter more frequently than, say, inexperienced users, unless they have been doing a lot of investigation on their own. And that is, do we build these tunnels to be permanent on the soil, or do we build them to be movable? I know that Othos said, and Aaron mentioned the importance of good quality soil, and Ted also mentioned and drainage. And Ted also mentioned that, and I think he was dead to rights. No dogma anymore. This is a something in progress design. So, the 4 of you, would you, the pros and cons of permanently sited tunnels versus tunnels that can be put on skids, modular, movable, what have you? Just a couple of comments.
I'm not familiar with high tunnels on skids. I have no experience whatsoever. But we did talk about how simple it is to install a high tunnel, drive the post, put up the bows, put on the cover, and you've got it. Well, I'll tell you though, when you start pulling all that stuff apart, taking up the post and moving them, it's not quite as simple, not quite as easy. So I'd say if you're going to do a lot of moving, opt maybe for the skids.
I would agree with basically in my situation, we grow so many varieties. I grow about 230 varieties of flowers, so I rotate crop. And I move it through, and I just do something different every year pretty much. I have a few staples, but because I have such a large area, I can move them around so they're not in the same soil every year. But the Haygrove design has an augered leg that the leg spins into the ground, so when it's time to move it, you can just reverse your hydraulic driller and screw it out of the ground. In England, they move a lot of tunnels. They move acres and acres and acres of strawberry tunnels because they don't run strawberries constantly in the same soil. They go on a 3-year system, then they go fallow for 3 years, and in that time, they move that entire structure. Haygrove themselves grows over 350 acres, and they move those acres every year. They're moving them around. So there is something to be said for that, but you can also go with the soilless mixtures. You can do more of a hydroponic system as well. Maybe use your soil until you feel that you're creating a disease problem, then go to hydroponic, then move it. Maybe something like that kind of rotation would work.
Well, I just know what I've seen people, basically, there are an awful lot of people with permanent tunnels in. And they just put them in, they never move them again. And, but a lot of the people who have kind of put in movable ones are kind of thinking about soil improvement and soil maintenance and organic. So Elliot Coleman put in his, and he's like, has his cover crop, his clover growing outside, and then he pulls them there on skids, and then he pulls it, after a couple of years or a year and a half, whatever it is, and moves it. Some people even move them within the season. That putting them on skids seems to work pretty well. And there are people who have permanent tunnels that haven't seemed to run into problems. So you just keep adding organic matter, throwing compost in, and maybe don't run into problems. At the same time, if you look at typically people, they're in permanent location and they do run into problems. And I think that virtually all vegetable crops, all solanaceous crops anyway, that are grown in tunnels in Asia are probably grafted onto disease-tolerant rootstocks. And it's probably at least partly related to the soil disease problems. And so, and I noticed that there's a real flurry of activity, interest in grafting in the United States among researchers anyway. But like I say, fellow like Steve Moore in Pennsylvania, now he's down in North Carolina. He had kind of fixed tunnels, adds organic matter, and there are other people, they're conventional growers. They just, just as long as you take care of your soil, you may not run into problems. And if you're a conventional grower, there are actually people who run into problems and then they fumigate. So, it's Steve Groff, I think, up in Pennsylvania, ran into problems with verticillium. Now he's back in business. And the thing is, you have to have a pretty good labor crew to be thinking about unscrewing and screwing in your posts. And
Aaron, any comments on movable versus permanent?
The reason we went with the movable was on skids was because of the labor. It's so much easier to move around instead of pull them out.
For those that are in the audience, we're going to take just a couple of minutes, 5 to 7 minute break here to allow the audio folks to make a transition. And in that time, I encourage you to use a card, strip of paper if you don't have a card available, write down a question if you have it, and then one of us will come by to pick it up. And then we'll keep the discussion going. And I think the question about movable versus permanent, I don't want to dwell on it too long, but I would like to say that it probably has the potential to affect everything else in the system. Because we heard Keith say, well, crops. I essentially my soil-based problems are minimized because I rotate so much. And then Ted mentioned, well, you might need to fumigate or just take care of your soil, add compost. So the question of whether or not the tunnels is going to get moved around, I think, is a big one. And whether you're an experienced high tunnel user or somebody that's getting into it for the first time, that might be a design question that comes up right from the get. So that, a number of years ago, we might not have considered movable ones. You either put it on the ground or you basically didn't. So, Mo, we have one final question and we'll get to the break.